Okay, I think we should get started with the second session, where Pascal Méchard is going to present a paper with a wonderful formula title, U star equals square root of UV. I love this title. A lot of the comms people were a little more skeptical. Take it away, Pascal.
Yes, thanks for inviting us. All right. This is a paper about the full employment rate of unemployment, or FERU, in the US. And what we are doing in the paper, it's try to figure out what is the level of full employment in the United States. And what we'll show you is that the FERU, which we denote U star, is given by the square root of U and V, where U is the unemployment rate and V is the vacancy rate. The first step in trying to figure out what is this FERU, what is full employment, is to translate the legal concept of full employment into economic terms. So first, where does this concept of full employment come from? Why do we have a full employment mandate? So the first time that this was brought up was by the Employment Act of 1946. So after the Great Depression and World War II, then this was reaffirmed with the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, that's 1978, and full employment or maximum employment was also mentioned in the Federal Reserve Reform Act of 1977. So in these three acts, basically the law says that it's the mandate of the federal government and the Fed to try to maintain the economy at full employment. But the law doesn't really say, what is full employment. There is no definition of full employment in there. However, if you look at the text of law, what you see is that it's always talking about how full employment is going to be good for welfare, and how being at full employment is going to, maximize well-being. So here, the way we translate full employment is very straightforward. We're going to say that full employment is just social efficiency, and therefore the FERU is going to be the rate of unemployment that's efficient. So that's how we are going to interpret. That legal mandate. Now, how are we going to compute this efficient rate of unemployment? So that's pretty simple. So let me show you the derivation. So we consider a social planner that's trying to maximize welfare. So how do you maximize welfare in this type of model? So here what we have in mind are modern models of the labor market. Well, you have to maximize output, and to do that, what you have to do is minimize the non-productive use of labor. So what are the non-productive use of labor in this model? There are two sources. There are two forms of non-productive use of labor. One is, of course, unemployment. And of course, there's a bit of a question as to what unemployed workers do exactly. So they are looking for jobs, but they might have time to do some home production or to relax. But in practice, what you see in the data is that the psychological cost of being unemployed actually offsets any value from home production into unemployment. So here we're going to assume that, all the unemployed, they do not contribute at all to social welfare. So as a result, the unemployment rate U is going to be something that just doesn't contribute anything to social welfare. So that's going to be something that the social planner wants to minimize. The other non-productive use of labor in this model is recruiting. So workers, when they're employed, they can produce stuff that contributes to welfare, or they can be doing recruiting, so trying to hire new workers that are going to come into the firm. So if you think about academics, you can spend your time doing research, or you can spend your time recruiting new colleagues. And in practice, you divide your time between two things. But when you're doing recruiting and attending job talks and reading CVs and reading job market papers, you're not doing research, right? So it's taking time away from production. Now the challenge is, how is it that we're going to measure the number of recruiters in the economy? Because unfortunately, that's not something that's yet in government statistics. But what we see in the data is that roughly you can measure the number of recruiters in the economy by the number of vacancies in the economy. Because in practice, in the data, it takes one worker to look after one vacancy. So to measure the number of recruiters in the economy, we are just going to look at the number of vacancies in the economy. So as a result, that's why we are saying that the social planner wants to minimize U plus V, the unemployment rate plus the vacancy rate, because these are all the people who are idle or doing recruiting. Now, if you want to minimize U plus V, it's pretty simple. What you could say, well, this is a very trivial problem. We'll set U to 0, V to 0 will be done. However, that's not possible. Why? Because there is a Beveridge curve in the background. And the Beveridge curve tells us that we cannot reduce both U and V at the same time. And in fact, in the US, the Beveridge curve has a very simple shape. It's an hyperbolic, it's an hyperbola, rectangular hyperbola. So the product of U and V is always equal to a constant. So because of that Beveridge curve, you can't just set U and V to 0. You have a trade-off between the unemployment rate and the vacancy rate. And in fact, here on the slide, you can see the first order condition that solves this planner's problem. So we're just trying to minimize U plus V subject to U times V is equal to A. It's the same as minimizing U plus A over U. You take the derivative of U is 1, derivative of A over U is minus A over U star. You set that to 0. What you get? U star is equal to square root of A. So what you see from here is that the efficient unemployment rate in this simple model is just given by the square root of the location of the Beveridge curve. So the location of the Beveridge curve is what determines the FERU here. And then, because we want to have a rule that's very easy to use for policymakers, we don't want to have A in there, but we know that A is always equal to U times V, so you can get A out, put U times V in there, and you get that the FERU is a geometric average of the unemployment rate and the vacancy rate. So that's where this formula comes from. So now, if you don't even want to take a square root, actually, just from this simple result, you can get a very easy-to-use criterion to figure out whether your labor market is at full employment or too hot or too cold. How do you do that? Well, it's pretty simple. So full employment means your unemployment rate is equal to U star. But U star is square root of UV. So at full employment, U has to be equal to V. So you can keep track of the unemployment rate, you keep track of the vacancy rate. When the two are equal, you know they're at full employment. Then by the same logic, if the unemployment rate is above the vacancy rate, you know that your economy is too slack. If your unemployment rate is below the vacancy rate, you know that your economy is too tight. All right, so now let me show you what happened if we look at US data. How is the US economy doing? All right, so we can go back to 1930. So we have data for unemployment and vacancies going back to 1930. So this data where there are many primary sources, but Petrosky, Nadeau, and Zeng harmonize them and put them all together. So here you can see the unemployment rate. This is all going to be on a log scale because the fluctuations in unemployment and vacancy over the past century are so wide that if you don't use a log scale, you're not going to be able to see anything. So we put everything on a log scale. So here I'm just giving you the primary sources. Before 1948, the unemployment rate was computed by David Ware. After 1948, this is just BLS data obtained from the CPS. Vacancies, you have three different sources. Before 1951, it's a MedLife help wanted advertising index. Between 51 and 2000, it's a conference board help wanted advertising index. And then since 2001, the BLS is computing vacancies through the JOLTS. All right, so the first thing you should notice is that, so you see here, the unemployment rate and vacancy rate, of course, they move in opposite direction. When unemployment goes up, the vacancy rate goes down. That's because we have a Beveridge curve in the background. But something else you can see on this log scale is that actually unemployment rate and vacancy rate, they describe this nice butterfly pattern. They are very symmetric. And that's because the Beveridge curve is an hyperbola. So when unemployment goes up by 1%, vacancies go down by 1%. That's why you have this nice symmetry. And also, we have many different data sources here, all put together, but still it's quite a clean pattern. So what do we learn from that? Well, one first obvious finding just from this graph, you can see that the unemployment rate is almost always above the vacancy rate. So what this is telling you is that your economies in the US, it's almost always too slack. We are not at full employment, we're inefficiently slack. However, there are a few rare episodes in which the unemployment rate is actually too low. And what's quite interesting is that these episodes are not random. They correspond to very specific historical events. So you can see here on the graph any any orange area tells you that the economy was inefficiently hot. And you can see they correspond to the major wars that the US fought. So you have World War II, where you had a labor market that was too hot. Then you have the Korean War. Then you have the Vietnam War. And then the last event is actually the recovery from COVID. So in that, the last few years have been quite exceptional because we had never seen really a peacetime episode of inefficient tightness in the US. But that's something we've witnessed in the middle of 2021. So this is the state of the labor market. Now from this, you can very easily compute the FERU. So I told you the FERU, so it's square root of UV, the geometric average of the unemployment rate and vacancy rate. But here, because I'm on a log scale, actually my FERU is just going to be the midpoint between the unemployment rate and the vacancy rate. So here we have the FERU in the US. And what you can see is that although the unemployment rate fluctuates a lot, the vacancy rate fluctuates a lot, the FERU is very stable. So the average for the FERU is 4.1% over roughly the last century. It's always between 2.5% and 6.5%, so it's within a fairly narrow band. And the last reading here is 4.4%, so that's U star as of the second quarter of 2024. So now, from that, you can infer what is the unemployment gap, so the gap between the unemployment rate and the FERU. And that unemployment gap is, of course, very countercyclical, because the unemployment rate is very countercyclical, but the FERU is very stable. So here I'm showing you a few readings. So this is the unemployment gap. You can see it's almost always positive because the economy is always almost always too slack. Of course, the biggest unemployment gap was during the Great Depression, no surprise there. The unemployment gap was above 20 percentage points. Then, the Volcker recession, the Great Recession, you have unemployment gaps around 6 percentage points. And the pandemic, it was a short recession, but again, the unemployment gap was above 6 percentage points. So these are quite large deviations from efficiency or from full employment. And I think here you can also see, the unemployment gaps on the negative side when the economy was too hot. And here you can see that during the pandemic, the unemployment gap was very negative, minus 1.5 percentage points. So it's something we hadn't seen since the end of World War II. So really conveying this idea that the labor market in the recovery of the pandemic was extremely hot. All right, so now what I want to show you quickly is how our measure of full employment differs from measures that the Fed often use. And there are two such measures. So one is, of course, the natural rate of unemployment that the CBO produces. And you can see our FERU is usually below the natural rate of unemployment. Actually, it turns out that they coincide right now. They're exactly at the same level, but that's just a coincidence. You can also plot the NERU. And so this is the NERU that was computed by Richard Crump and co-authors. So they had a Brookings paper a few years ago developing a method to compute the NERU. You can see our FERU is also almost always below the NERU. So, if the Fed use, of course, the NERU or the natural rate as targets, then it's no surprise that the labor market was always too slack, according to our measure, because according to us, they used targets that were just too high. They were not ambitious enough in thinking about full employment. I should also say, of course, so the NERU and the natural rate of unemployment, we don't think they're a good measure of full employment. So the NERU is all about price stability. It's about the price mandate. It has nothing to do with the employment mandate. The natural rate of unemployment is computed by assuming that in 2005, the labor market is at full employment. But of course, we don't know, without a theory of full employment, we don't know whether the labor market is at full employment or not. So we don't think these two measures are actually a good measure of full employment. All right, I have 2 more minutes, so let me show you 2 extra slides. One is that here I showed you the representation with unemployment rate and vacancy rate, but actually, if you need just one variable that summarizes everything, that's labor market tightness, the ratio of vacancy to unemployment. So here I'm showing you again on a log scale the labor market tightness in the US, so it's the vacancy to unemployment ratio. Full employment appears very easily here because full employment is when you have as many vacancies as unemployed, so it's a tightness of 1. And so when labor market tightness is below 1, you know that you're too slack. When labor market tightness is above 1, you know that you're too tight. And so here, this is what we have. You can see all the episodes I mentioned earlier. They appear very clearly on this graph. And it's quite interesting. If you look at the end of the graph, you can see what happened during the recession, that followed during the COVID recession. So we had a big drop in tightness. We had a very rapid recovery. And then we go back to something that the roamers discussed yesterday. So actually the labor market reached full employment around the middle of 2021. And then tightness kept rising to reach a level of 2 in the middle of 2022, which is a tightness level we hadn't seen since the end of World War II. And so you have again this period between middle of 2021, middle of 2022, where, so yesterday we saw that inflation was too high. Here I'm showing you that the labor market was too hot, and yet the Fed didn't do anything. They waited until the middle of 2022 to raise rates. So this adds, if you want, even more to the puzzle of why that delay in raising rates. I have a few more seconds. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is talk a bit about the combination of vacancy and unemployment. So vacancy data, they are a bit the black sheep data of business cycles. People don't know very well. They don't know them very well. They don't know where they come from. They don't know what they mean. They don't trust them. But we think that combining unemployment and vacancy data is actually very powerful. So today I showed you how you can use for normative analysis, but they actually also have predictive power. So we have another paper in which we use the same unemployment and vacancy data to try to predict recessions. So what we do is basically we start from the SAM rule that I'm sure most of you know that I plotted here, which is just looking at when the unemployment rate goes up and is declaring that a recession has started when the unemployment rate basically increased above 0.5 percentage point. So this works well if you are starting from the 1960s. But you can do a SAM rule with vacancies, which is what I'm showing you here. And this works also pretty well. But the key thing to realize that in the type of models we have in mind, when you have a recession, unemployment goes up and vacancies go down. So what you can do is you can require both of them to move. You can take the minimum of this indicator. And when you do that, you get something that's much less noisy, because if you describe a recession as wanting both higher unemployment and lower vacancy, you get a much cleaner signal of the recession. When you do that, you can lower your threshold to 0.3 percentage point. You get something that's much faster at detecting recessions. And if we apply to today, what you can see, so this is our indicator constructing with unemployment and vacancies, you can see that actually the US might have entered a recession as early as March of this year. And what's nice with this is so not only you get an indicator that's faster than the SAM rule, it also works over the entire sample. So this is, you can actually detect the 15 recessions since the Great Depression, and you have no errors at all. There are no false positives. So you get, whereas the SAM rule actually breaks down before 1960. So by combining unemployment and vacancies, you can also get a really good indicator of recession. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Our first discussant is Hee-Ju Ahn.
So I thank the organizers for giving me this chance to discuss this important paper about the U-Star. I'm Hee-Ju Ahn from the Federal Reserve Board, so the usual disclaimer applies. So Pascal already did a great job in explaining the paper, so let me jump into the actual discussion. The paper provides a novel characterization of the U-Star, guided by a theory. And the beauty of their formula is that it's easy to implement, which is great news for a practitioner like me. So in my discussion, I'm going to first discuss the implication of the missing piece in theory. Okay? And then I'm going to try to explore the level and growth of the full employment directly, and then consider broad-based and inclusive field. Okay, theory. So here I'm going to argue that a model with job separation margin, with a higher elasticity of unemployed workers, can still explain the observed in the rectangular hyperbolic beverage curve, but will lead us to higher U-Star. Okay, so here's my model. So unemployment model with unemployment inflows, the job separation margin. So here, my matching function has a standard Cobb-Douglas function. With the elasticity parameter to the vacancy rate is 0.3, and the elasticity parameter for the unemployment rate is 0.7. Okay, so 0.3, the constant in the front, is a matching efficiency parameter. Okay, so if you divide both sides by U, then the job finding probability becomes a function of the market tightness V over U. Okay. And the unemployment rate standard in the literature is approximated with the job separation rate, over the sum of the separation and, job finding rate. Here, S is the separation rate. Okay, let's consider two cases, okay? In period 1, the vacancy rate is 4%, and the job separation rate is 1.25%, and the job finding probability is 30%. So once we are given with the vacancy rate and the separation rate, we can solve for the other parameters. So in the first period, when the vacancy rate is 4% and the separation rate is 1.25%, unemployment rate is 4%. And suppose that there is a recession the vacancy rate is 2%, okay? Vacancy rate is halved, and the separation rate is 1.75%, the job loss rises. Now our unemployment rate is 8%, okay? So vacancy rate is halved and unemployment rate doubled. So we still have, this rectangular hyperbolic average curve relationship. But now, our social planner has a different constraint that is, Cobb-Douglas matching function. So in this economy, the optimal market tightness is 3/7, less than 1, okay? Meaning that in this economy, less tightness and higher U star are optimal because, job seekers contribute more to a match than recruiters. The social planner wants, higher U star. So the takeaway, of this demonstration is that the countercyclical job separation is a feature of the business cycle, okay? So once we consider that, and also once we consider the higher elasticity parameter of the unemployed workers, which has the empirical ground, then we can still, explain, the observed rectangular, hyperbolic average curve, but we'll have a higher U star. Okay, now let me move on to the estimating, level and growth of the full employment, the E star. So if you are interested in full employment, why don't we directly estimate it, okay? And then see whether, where we are in terms of the full employment, nowadays. So here, as a cyclical indicator, I'm going to focus on the employment to population ratio, which is one of the important, cyclical labor market indicators. And the merit of the employment to population ratio is that the measure is affected less by misclassification errors, relative to unemployment rate and the participation rate. And also, pay attention to the payroll gains, right? So we need some cyclical benchmark for it as well. So here I propose a new concept based on, FAIR formula that is the level of full employment, okay? FE means the full employment, and EP means the employment in population or employment in payrolls, okay? So here the definition of FEEP at time t is 1 minus FIRO multiplied by participation rate trend. Here participation rate trend is the non-cyclical component of the participation rate and multiplied by population, okay? Here the participation rate trend is from Hornstein and Kudlab. So if FEEP and FIRO disagree with each other, then the source is the participation rate cyclicality. And let's see how relevant that is in the assessment of the full employment. And turns out that it is. Panel A shows the unemployment rate and FIRO, okay? Unemployment rate is blue line and black line is FIRO. And panel B shows employment to population ratio and FEEP EPOP ratio, the black line. So red circles capture the period when both FEEP and FIRO say that we are at or above full employment. But green bar, green arrows, depict the period, when FEEP says that we are at full employment, but FIRO says that we are not there yet, okay? So it turns out that participation rate cyclicality is important in assessing the full employment, and according to FEEP, labor market tends to reach full employment in a mature expansion, okay? So the takeaway here is that FEEP indicates less slack than what FIRO suggests. Okay, so here's a new opportunity to all of us. So it turns out that the FEEP gains, the FEEP growth, the employment growth that is needed to maintain the full employment can serve as a nice benchmark for payroll when we assess the cyclical position of the economy. Okay, so here you are looking at the payroll gains, the blue line, and the black line is the FEEP gains, the benchmark. So here are empirical regularities that I uncovered. So in a mature expansion, payroll gains, seem to be very similar, to FEEP gains, okay? But when a recession comes, payroll gains, become slower than FEEP gains. Of course, we are interested in, recent period, right? So let's take a look at what happened to the pandemic period and the recent months. So the sample period here is from 2020 January through the August 2024. So panel A shows the EPOP ratio, the blue line, and the black line is FIB EPOP ratio, and the red line is FIRU implied EPOP ratio. So according to this measure, so the economy has reached full employment in 2022. We discussed it yesterday, right? Okay. So it seems like, so looking at the 2023 and the recent months, so, the FIRU, labor force participation rate, and the FIB, the FIRU implied EPOP ratio and FIB EPOP ratio seem to diverge. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about, whether that reflects immigration or, the cyclical strength in the, labor force participation rate. So there's some uncertainty about it. But both the indicators, say that we are at full employment. So let's take a look at panel B that shows payroll gains and FIB gains and FIRU implied employment gains. So from 2023, actually the second half of the 2024, payroll gains, these two other benchmark gains, move in lockstep with each other and gradually moving toward zero, meaning that the economy is reaching to the full employment. Essentially, the gradient, is close to zero. Okay, so if you ask me, are we in a recession? I would say it's less likely. But if you ask me, is the recession is coming? Then I would say the risk is elevated. But the caveat is that, we know that there is uncertainty and the measurement issues in the payroll employment these days. So I have 4 minutes. Now let me discuss the broad-based and explore actually broad-based and inclusive FIRU. So incorporating heterogeneity in the assessment of the full employment is a difficult job. So let me take first step based on my own research that I did with Bart and Aisha Shahin. So in our paper, we argued that the U.S. labor market is approximately the dual labor market structure supplemented with the tertiary segment representing home production. Okay? So primary segment is constituting the 55% of the civilian population has the unemployment rate of 2% only, very low. Okay? The secondary market composing 14% of the population, has the unemployment rate of 26% on average. Okay? And this small segment, account for the 60% of the unemployment pool on average. The tertiary segment composing 31% of the population, people there are mostly out of the labor force. But when they enter the labor force, they experience an unemployment rate of 20%. Okay? So here I make an extreme assumption. That is that this nice FIRU formula can be applied to all three markets, and in all three markets see the same aggregate vacancy rate. I know that this assumption is extreme, so I'm going to revisit that. And let's see, what happened, what is the FIRU level in this, three labor market. So panel A shows the, primary unemployment rate, which is a dotted line, and the thick line is the primary FIRU, okay? The panel B shows the secondary and tertiary unemployment rate. The dotted lines are, secondary red and tertiary, blue unemployment rate, and the thick lines are FIRUs. So primary segment rarely experiences slack, but the other segments are always in slack, okay? So if you buy this analysis, then takeaway is that FIRU may not represent anyone's full employment experiences. If you don't buy this analysis, then it means that we need different models for the broad-based and inclusive FIRU. But let me give you another interesting example, racial disparities. So I took the data of the total unemployment rate, whites unemployment rate, and blacks unemployment rate, and take the logs and diminished it. And then I plotted, and it turns out that they essentially match up with each other. That means that this FIRU formula can be applied to the whites unemployment rate and blacks unemployment rate, because it means that this rectangular hyperbolic average curve relationship applies to both racial groups. So I calculated the FIRU for whites and black. So panel A shows white Americans, unemployment rate, the dotted line, and FIRU, the thick line. So white Americans experience full employment during most of the mature expansion. But black Americans, they never experienced full employment until 2019. So if we care about welfare, and that's the reason why we care about U-Star, then we should think about these disparities and welfare. Of course, let me confess a caveat to this analysis. So So black's job separation rate is much higher than white's job separation rate. So once we consider that margin into account, black's U-star can be higher than what you are seeing. So I tried to find the aggregate implications. So I I weighted these aggregate measures using the population weights. And here you are looking at the dual labor market considered. The fee rule is the red line, and the blue is the aggregate fee rule. So meaning that once we consider macro heterogeneity into account, there can be less slack and the U-star can be higher than what the baseline fee rule suggests. Okay, so let me wrap up. So in my discussion, I showed that once we consider the job separation margin with higher elasticity of unemployed workers and participation rate cyclicality and macro heterogeneity, there can be less slack than what the baseline fee rule suggests, or the fee rule can be higher. Okay? Here I didn't have time for this, but once we consider the measurement errors in the CPS, in the current population survey, there can be more slack. Okay? So the data quality matters. So the risks are both sides, but perhaps more to the side of the less slack or higher U-star. So going forward, let me just mention two more things and wrap up. So as an econometrician by training, I would like to mention this. So this U-star or fee rule may be more precisely identified in a multivariate setup, and the estimate can be more efficient. And second, conceptually, fee rule, NIRU, and natural rates are, different. But empirically, they can share some, common dynamics, meaning that, theoretically, there can exist a set of conditions or a state under which these three stars, are aligning. And that can be important in thinking about the optimal monetary policy and policy evaluation. Thank you.
Our second discussant is Bart Hobein.
Well, thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper with a title that I also really like. It has something very Einstein-esque to it, so I think that's really wonderful. And so I guess this is a very simple policy prescription, and I think that's very attractive that it's simple. But I think it's also important to kind of discuss why it's so simple, and when we should take it seriously, and when maybe we should realize that there's some assumptions that we might question. So that's my task here. So let me just start with the three assumptions behind this fee rule, and because it's so simple, I'll do this kind of in an Econ 101 framework. So this is beverage space. Suppose we observe an unemployment rate of 8 and a vacancy rate of 2. That's just by example, or maybe if you believe Pascal's last slide, this will be 6 months from now, but I'm not that pessimistic. But then basically what this paper says is what the government should do is minimize the sum of the unemployment and vacancy rate. So it gives you this indifference curve. It's a linear indifference curve. And then there's a technology, which is the beverage curve, which they define as a hyperbolic curve. I'll discuss why this approximation might actually matter later on. And policy moves, we're always on the beverage curve, according to them, which is not always true according to most models, just for the record. But let's leave that as an assumption, because deviations from the beverage curve tend to be relatively short because of the adjustment dynamics in the labor market. So we're always on the beverage curve, and policies move us along the beverage curve by stimulating labor demand, I guess. The paper's not very specific on how you do that, but let's just assume that's how you do it. Then because this beverage curve has this particular hyperbolic shape, the optimal point, the pharaoh as they call it, is on the 45-degree line. And so there's three assumptions here that are important. Should we minimize U plus V? Is every policy, are our policies moving us along the beverage curve? Are they potentially moving the beverage curve? And then on top of that, there is this approximation to the beverage curve, a good approximation. So I'll cover all three of them, but the most important one is this. The bottom line of what I want to say is, this is not the only paper. There's several recent papers that I would say get hung up with a vacancy of unemployment rate of 1, and I'm very skeptical from a measurement point of view that that is something that you want to use as an anchor. So let me kind of spend most of my time on that. So the main assumption that they argue is basically a marginal rate of transformation of 1 between unemployment and vacancies. And they quote there's a huge literature on the cost of hires. There's actually a whole field of economics that covers the cost of hires. I don't meet very many people who work on personnel economics, but I do give speeches to people who do human resource management, or I used to when I was at ASU. So let me cover a few things. First of all, the cost of a hire is actually the relative cost. It's not constant over time. I think Steve has a QGE paper with John and with Jason on this that shows that the vacancy yield is very, very cyclical. And so assuming that this vacancy yield is not cyclical, which is kind of implicit in the assumption in this paper, I find a little dubious. And then on top of that, the literature on cost of a hire measures every hire. We don't distinguish whether we hire someone out of unemployment, or whether we hire them of non-participation, or whether we hire them job to job. Now that is very important because the cost of a hire is about $4,800 per hire. That's high. But the Society for Human Resource Management actually publishes the distribution among respondents of the cost of a hire. So the average is $4,800, but the 75th percentile is only $4,200, and the 25th percentile, which presumably is hiring Kamala Harris in a job in McDonald's, which seems to be a highly touted hire that we hear a lot about, that's probably not $4,800 cost because and there's many short tenure jobs for which if you spend $4,800 on hiring a person, that will be way bigger than the surplus of the job. So mixing those costs across different types of hires and aggregating them and then applying them to unemployment, I find a little hard to understand exactly what the cost of hiring out of unemployment is from that. And then there's unpriced benefits of vacancies mostly because, we don't really know whether the Great Resignation was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe people moved to jobs that they're much better matches at, and that's why we're now seeing strong productivity growth. Maybe that was not the case, but the point is there might be other benefits there that are actually not necessarily included in the price. So that's on the kind of this marginal rate of transformation. The second thing that I just want to say is that I'm really skeptical about interpreting job openings literally as the level of unmet demand for the unemployed. And this gets done frequently, and I think that's just... Now, the time series that Pascal included also is mixed with centimeters of hiring at job advertisements that the Conference Board collected, for example. That clearly is not the level of unmet labor demand. That's a proxy. So I think that is important to say. And let me show you why I think this is important. I plotted here something that I labeled differently than Pascal has it in his charts, but it's kind of the same point. So there's a discussion about demand and supply and the labor demand, and the demand coming more in balance with supply. And a lot of people make this plot, where they plot the labor force, and then as demand they have a proxy, which is employment for the CPS plus job openings. But job openings are, first of all, they're jobs. Secondly, they're also hires out of not only hires out of unemployment. And we, in this room, probably have never applied to a job opening that would be part of JOLTS, because that job opening you need to start working within 30 days, but most of us don't even apply to job openings like that. So what you're seeing is that it looks like there's always excess supply and a low demand, but that might just be because the job openings level is under-measuring the level of unmet labor demand simply because of the way vacancies are defined in JOLTS. So I think that's the most important part. Now, there's a couple of other things. To give you a theoretical example of why you should take minimizing the sum of U and V seriously, and they introduce a version of the Mortis-Pissarides model. But in the particular example they give, the whole model is proportional in productivity, which means that unemployment and vacancies don't move when there's a productivity shock. So I'm sure there's other examples that you can give where that's not the case, but this particular example I find not particularly useful to understand why you would minimize the sum of U and V in this theoretical framework. Though I like this example because I tend to think of optimal policy as moving in a kind of in a labor market framework, moving productivity or stimulating labor demand. And then you have two constraints, a Beveridge curve and a labor demand constraint, a labor demand equation. So it's almost like a principal agent problem. And then I think there's been a lot of discussion. What is the cost of doing this? In terms of the inflationary costs are included that as phi. And there's been many papers recently about that. So you can think of this framework in an output inflation trade-off, but that's different from what's done in this paper. In the remaining time, let me talk about two short things. First of all, this paper assumes that policy keeps the Beveridge curve fixed. And that's probably true for monetary policy, although hard landings cause maybe a temporary increase in separations. But that's not true for many other policies. And that's actually important. This paper focuses on kind of the whole broad federal mandate, federal government mandate of maximizing employment. But I think rightfully so in the framework, the long-term framework for the Fed, it's explicitly stated that maximum employment is a goal that varies because of many factors that are outside of the control of monetary policy. And those are things that move the Beveridge curve. So what's in this paper is really might be useful for monetary policy, but might not be so useful for other policies that actually affect the position of the Beveridge curve, like UI, but also like WIOA, which is probably the thing that the biggest act that is meant to improve labor market functioning. And then the final thing, Hiju covered this already, but I think it's worthwhile doing. If you put in, instead of the Beveridge curve is this hyperbola, if you put in the Beveridge curve actually as the functional form that most of us use, like the one that Figura and Waller used, that Hiju was also referring to, then the solution to the problem that they have, you're going to minimize U and V, U plus V, sorry, not necessarily that I think that's an objective you should have, but suppose you have that, but you don't face the Beveridge curve they have, but a different Beveridge curve, then that depends on the position and the shape of the Beveridge curve. The shape is given by the match elasticity. Close to a match elasticity of 0.5, the solution, the approximate solution with the approximate Beveridge curve they use, is actually close to the solution you'd get with the functional form I would use for the Beveridge curve. There's a 0.3 of a percentage point difference. Now, I learned yesterday from reading Charlie's paper that some people actually dissent on an FOMC decision when they disagree with Nehru estimates by 0.3 of a percentage point. So that might be more material than I realized before these meetings. But it is relatively small. But if you take an estimate like Figura-Waller, we're talking about the whole population of West Virginia difference in the unemployment rate. So this approximation is actually, it looks nice, A is U times V, but it is, when you actually solve the problem that the authors are solving, it's not an immaterial assumption that that's your approximation to the Beveridge curve. The Beveridge curve, the shape of the Beveridge curve really matters, just to kind of reiterate what Hiju said. So, to end my discussion, let me just say that I like the Einstein-esque title of this paper, but I don't think that this is the E is MC squared of economics. But I really think what I liked about this paper, and I've done a lot of work on the labor market, is it made me really think differently about how should we think about maximum employment. We at the Fed are very focused on the Nehru and think a lot about the interaction between employment and the inflation rate. But let's take inflation out of the picture for a moment. How would you think about a world where you weren't even concerned about inflation? How could you think about maximum employment in that context? And this paper is really trying to find a conceptual and normative framework to think about this, and I think there's a real value added to that, even though I don't necessarily agree with the policy description. And I do think that is useful because at the end, the current framework defines maximum employment as a broad-based and inclusive goal that's not directly measurable. But for someone who works at the Fed who's asked to give answers about the labor market, that's not the clearest guidance about what's asked for me to look at. So in that sense, this paper helped me also give a little bit more direction in that sense. Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to mention that the second author of the paper, Emmanuel Saez, is with us online, and we also have other people listening online. And I'm actually going to start this time with a question from one of those people online, Bob Hall. All right, maybe Bob is not ready. I'll give him a minute and call on him again. Steve Davis.
This is cruel. This This happened to me. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
No. Yes, okay. All right. Well, this actually began as a comment that I formulated for the first session yesterday, but we didn't get to me, so I'm going to pursue it now, and it fits right in. And that is that the discussions of monetary policy almost always assume that the natural rate U star is a constant. And there's a huge amount of research that's reflected in this the session we're looking at now, in which U star is an endogenous variable of the system, and that's a big step forward. The amount of variability, though, in U star is relatively small compared to other estimates, including work that I've done with Mariana Kudliak, which I recommend and you can get from her website. Let me just mention one thing one problem that permeates the literature today, which is misunderstanding of what happened during COVID. During COVID, workers were counted as unemployed who had kept their jobs, but temporarily lost their work because they were put on temporary, and almost all of those workers were recalled. And so it's really important to separate these people are irrelevant to the matching process because they have not lost their matches. And Mariana and I have written a paper on that, which should be mandatory reading in this literature because it manages, it gets rid of that huge spike in which it looks like the DMP model is just not working. And the answer is that you're applying it to the wrong people. So every time you see a huge spike in somebody who's doing recent labor market dynamics, find out whether they correctly understand that the big spike was not job loss and search, but rather was people waiting for successfully to be recalled to their work, and it makes the DMP style understanding of what happened during COVID much slicker, and so I urge everybody in this growing profession to pay attention to this proper understanding of what happened during COVID and get rid of that big spike of misunderstood status of workers.
Steve?
Yeah, thank you to the authors for the interesting paper and the great discussions. I want to start by putting some numbers around what I think is an important point that Bart made, and that's whether we should interpret the JOLTS-based vacancy measures literally as a measure of unmet labor demand. And he suggested not, and I want to amplify that point. So in my 2013 QG paper with Faberman and Halterwinger, one of the things we do in that paper is construct an estimate for the fraction of hires that are not mediated through the JOLTS concept of vacancies. Bart has already made the point that by design, the JOLTS vacancy concept doesn't capture certain vacancies like the ones that are typically relevant for our jobs. So the number that we estimate is 14%, okay? So and I'll just repeat that. The JOLTS vacancy concept misses 14% of the vacancies that are nonetheless show up in the JOLTS hires concept, okay? In addition to that, there's a separate factor, an additive factor. The JOLTS sample doesn't capture the youngest employers for very practical reasons. It's very challenging to immediately identify from the universe administrative sources the newest establishments and put them in to the JOLTS panel survey, okay? And it won't surprise you to know that new establishments and more generally very young establishments have a lot of hiring, and so they have a lot of vacancies relative to their share of employment. So if I had to guess, that I'd say that something like that the JOLTS vacancy numbers are something like 15 to 18% below what we might think of as the underlying vacancy rate concept that corresponds to the JOLTS data. Now, that's an average, and we did not look at this in the paper, but as Bart suggested, that number probably fluctuates cyclically as well, okay? Now, I want to relate this to one of Hee-Ju's points. She had a different way to approach whether the labor markets are slack or tight. Her basic conclusions there are in line with, if you just take the points I made about the understatement and refer to the pictures that Pascal showed, all of those vacancy series he's got are too low. They should shift them all up, okay? By different amounts at different points in time, that's less clear. So, or exactly how much is unclear. It's clear you should always shift it up. So that rather changes your interpretations about whether we're mostly in periods of slack or labor market tightness. So this is just a first order issue. And unless I missed it, there's no discussion of this in the paper. There's no discussion of the measurement of the V part. There's a discussion of the measurement of the U part, and Bob Hall just added some important observations about the U part as well. But if you're going to try to operationalize this formula, then there's really a bunch of first order measurement issues you need to address. Now, one more comment if I can. There were some nice discussions of the assumptions that went into the model and that led to the formula. I just want to stress one more, and that is, as I understand it, the simplicity of the formula, and it's nice to have a simple formula, rests on a very aggressive assumption about the value of time when you're unemployed, okay? And the baseline assumption in the analysis is that there's zero time, there's zero value to being unemployed, zero private and social, zero social value. There may be private value in the form of unemployment benefits, but zero social value. Now, I agree with Pascal that there are psychological costs of being unemployed. I take them seriously and so on. Nonetheless, this is a very aggressive assumption. So I want to refer to another paper that I have, which speaks directly to the value of time that people assign to unemployment. So I've got a paper coming out in the AER with Pavel Krolakowski, in which we survey a population that's directly relevant to this question. We are surveying people who are collecting unemployment insurance benefits. We survey them the day after they get their first benefit check. And we ask them a bunch of questions about their willingness to have continued working on the job they just lost at a wage cut. So 2/3 of the people in this survey say they would not be willing to accept a wage cut of 25%, okay, to have continued working on their own job. The unemployment replacement rate in this sample is about 38% on average. So that says that at least 2/3 of the people in our sample have a value of time net of unemployment benefits that is more than 35% of the wage they just lost, and maybe worth much more. Maybe it's 50, 60%. So I just find there's many other pieces of evidence out there in the literature, but this formula, though, that simple formula, rests on this very aggressive assumption about the value of time, and some discussion about the sensitivity of the results to that assumption would be helpful.
Bill English.
I was struck by the figures showing that the NAIRU measures are much higher than the FAIRU measures. And it reminded me a bit of Barrow and Gordon and the idea that the socially efficient amount of labor may be higher than the sustainable level of employment that you can have and not have an inflationary effect. There are wedges there that matter, taxes on labor income and imperfect competition, which leads to markups that put a wedge between the socially efficient amount of labor, which may be higher, and the amount that's actually attainable without generating inflation, which is likely to be a lower level of employment. I wondered if that's captured in the model or if this just is a kind of something that looks the same but isn't in fact intellectually the same. Thanks.
Christy?
I want to follow up with something that is very similar to what Bill said, but I'll put it in a stronger version, which is that a concept of full employment that isn't consistent with stable inflation, I don't understand that as a sensible goal for policy. And so there's this measure may be interesting to talk about, but if you're thinking about conducting monetary policy or fiscal policy or anything else that you're doing, something that just isn't consistent with stable prices or stable inflation just doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's actually related to something that the discussion of the broad-based and inclusive maximum employment goal. I think one of the things that we lose sight of is the marginal groups that get hired when the unemployment rate is very low are exactly the groups that lose their jobs first when inflation is high and the Fed has to tighten. And so trying to separate those two goals, I think, is just not possible and very dangerous.
Okay, let me go back online. John Haltewanger?
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. So I think, I'll say an attractive feature of this approach is that it relies, at least in principle, on the DMP framework as a basis. And I think we all agree the DMP framework is sort of the core framework we should be using. Having said that, we've, I think, increasingly recognized we need to refine the DMP framework in some fundamental ways for it to match the data. And so what do I have in mind? We know the standard matching function that just specifies hires as a function of vacancies and unemployment does terribly in terms of matching two key outcomes, particularly the job filling rate and the job finding rate. The matching function does terribly on these. And so what we've been doing, many of us have been doing, I've done work with Steve Davis, a paper that was at Brookings a couple years ago with Catherine Abraham and Lee Riddell, partly based upon nice work that Bob Hall had done, is generalize the matching function to kind of recognize that, related to some of the discussants' comments, that not all vacancies are the same. Recruiting intensity varies across vacancies and across time, that hires come from more than just the unemployed, and search intensities vary quite dramatically across different groups within the unemployed and across different groups, including the employed and out of the labor force. And what we've discovered, by the way, you can say, well, the paper looked at this because it said, well, let's go consider broader measures of unemployment. We found that doesn't work very well, because all that does is just sort of, it counts all of those. Let's say if you go to U4 or U5, U6, it just counts all those equally, and that's just not sufficient. So if we're going to head in this direction, I think we need to try to think about, well, what would you do in this context if you used a generalized matching function instead of the traditional matching function? Last comment, I just want to echo Bart's point that the evidence is overwhelming that job-to-job flows are moving individuals up the productivity ladder. Do we know that worked especially well in the Great Resignation? Not yet, but historically, that's been the case. Thank you.
Carolyn?
I'm going to try to be brief because I think every comment I wanted to make has already been made nicely, so I'll try to be very brief. Bart made the point that the cost of servicing a vacancy assumption is quite aggressive in this paper, and it is very important for the formula. So that is one of the most important assumptions for the nifty formula to work. Steve Davis made the point that another important assumption for the nifty formula to work is that there's no social value to time while you're unemployed, because the psychological stress totally offsets all of the value of the leisure or time for home production. I think that's another very aggressive assumption, and Steve gave us some empirical evidence about why it's not very plausible. And then finally, I found Hiju's division of the labor market into primary, secondary, and tertiary to be very important. And it also underscores the importance of hiring from the out of the labor force pool, which is not trivial at all. So I think that's another important assumption that's built into the nifty formula. So I just, yeah, I'm just going to stop there.
Tara?
Thank you. So I'd like to make 2 points. So I want to two-hand Steve's point about having more discussion about the data issues around vacancies. In particular, one thing I'd like to highlight is if we want to use this for real-time policy making, we have to think about the data revisions process that's experienced in vacancies in a different way than what we're seeing with unemployment. And also, there was this really nice conference that was held here at Brookings back in January that talked specifically about the trend in vacancies over time, and that's an issue that might be driving some of this interpretation as well. The second point, somewhat related to that, is what are the challenges of taking the unemployment rate and the vacancy rate there together is that we have to think about composition in each one and the changes in those compositions over time. And so by bringing in vacancies as well, we're bringing in additional compositional challenges that are affecting the trends and probably will make it hard for us to actually target this in policy. Thank you.
Back online, Joe?
Thank you. I want to respond to Bill English's and Christy Romer's point, because I think it's a point that many macroeconomists would have. How useful is a measure of unemployment gap if it's always positive? Doesn't that just inconsistent with this, with macro model of inflation would be spiraling ever downward? And I think the answer, is really, and I'm surprised that Bart Hobein didn't mention this because he's done work on this as well as you, John Steinson. We know that if there's downward wage rigidity, it tends to bend the Phillips curve and give it a very flat segment. And then what you get is that the economy tends to operate above the natural rate of unemployment. Moreover, it's very difficult for central banks to estimate the natural rate of unemployment in that regime. And so there's overestimates of the natural rate and more reason that you're always above, with little downward pressure on inflation. That can go on for years and even decades, in my view, and I think we shouldn't just rule that out. I think that's actually an important feature. By the way, Rick Michigan raised the paper of McClay and Tenreiro that gave a reason for a flat Phillips curve based on optimal central bank behavior, where the central bank keeps unemployment near U-star. But that's a world in which there's just little information to estimate a Phillips curve, so you get a zero slope. In reality, the unemployment rate moves a lot. And so there's plenty of information, and it just is flat, has been flat for a long time. But that's just in a region, and we don't see the whole curve. Anyway, so I think I would caution people to not use this as a reason not to like the paper. I think actually the paper's results for the U.S., as improved a bit by Hiju, are still very plausible. Now, the final point is Bart ended with a point about labor market institutions shifting the beverage curve. I think that's very important if you want to take this to other countries. I've looked at the results of this paper applied to other countries, and they don't work so well. And I think the reason really is other countries have had, especially in Europe, have had much bigger labor market institutional changes that need to be addressed if you want to use this framework outside the U.S. and even in the U.S. Would benefit, improve the results.
Neil?
This is just, I think, to reiterate Christina and Joe's point about it would just be interesting to understand what the Phillips curve looks like, what Phillips curve regressions look like with your measure of full employment, and does it perform any better, or do you need to also rely on kinked Phillips curves to explain the behavior of inflation?
Valerie?
I just wanted to follow up on several people who would question the assumption that there's no value to unemployment. It since the 1970s, there's been evidence of pro-cyclical death rates, and now we have more recent evidence from Christopher Room, numerous others. And in fact, Karen Dynan and I were discussing yesterday this from a time use and care of family members concept, whether it's elderly family members or young children. There's just evidence that when you're working hard, other things fall by the wayside. So I think there is some value to unemployment, particularly for people who have dependents.
Oleg?
I wanted to return to Bart's last comment, and actually this is what Christina talked about. It's kind of very impressive that you can figure out the optimal unemployment level without any knowledge of the rest of the economy, like what are the shocks, what are the frictions in the background, right? And it kind of makes, like, there is the premise that we're talking about monetary policy as the tool to deal with this, but this is only true if the underlying frictions are sticky prices or sticky wages. If you think that unemployment was generated for other reasons, like there were a lot of jobs created in a part of the economy that actually did not live up to productivity expectations, or there is some financial shocks and vacancies cannot be created because of the financial constraints and stuff like that. Optimal monetary policy it can accommodate it, but it probably cannot resolve that problem at all. And so the knowledge of the U star might be useful, but you really need to know the sort of the frictions and the shocks in the background to sort of know how to respond to that.
Okay, so I'm going to send it back to the authors.
All right. Well, that's a lot of stuff. Let me just address a few things. So first of all, we derived this formula to have something simple because we thought that would be appealing to policymakers. But in the background, we have actually a paper that we wrote first that has a more complicated formula. And that formula, at the time when we wrote it, I guess nobody cared about it, but maybe now people will be interested to look at it. So it's going to address a lot of the things that we mentioned today. So the formula allows for a beverage curve that's not an hyperbola. You can just estimate the elasticity of the beverage curve, and the formula is going to take that into account. So that addresses what Bart says, that indeed, we don't know exactly what is the shape of the beverage curve. In fact, the beverage curve does change its shape over time, so the formula would allow for that. The formula allows for a value, a social value of unemployment that's not zero, of course, so you can make it high, Zero, we think is, it's something that's not completely unrealistic, but we don't know exactly what that value is, so you can plug it other value, you can make unemployment more valuable, and then you can see, okay, how does our FERU respond to that? You can also, then going back to vacancies, you can change the cost of a vacancy, you can put that cost in the formula and see what happened. And then in that previous paper, what we also do is then do a comprehensive analysis of the sensitivity of the FERU to all these parameters. But something I want to point out is that, so of course, if parameters, the cost of unemployment, the cost of recruiting, the shape of the beverage curve change, the FERU is going to change. But the bottom line is that for the range of things that we found in the literature and we thought was realistic, the FERU does not respond very much. So what I'm talking about is roughly 1 percentage point up, 1 percentage point down compared to a baseline if you cover the range of parameter values that you find in the literature. So it's not zero, and maybe tens of percentage points matter, but it's also not a vast amount compared to the fluctuations in unemployment themselves. That's one thing. On the moving the beverage curve with policies, that's something that Bart mentioned as well. So of course, if you think about unemployment insurance, that's going to move your beverage curve. You can't use this framework just as it is. You need a more complicated analysis. And there again, we've done work on that with Emmanuel and Camille, and then we have papers showing how that U star or theta star, in fact, is going to change if you have unemployment insurance. And it's more complicated, but the same framework can be used to think about these issues. So we don't have to use it only to think about monetary and fiscal policy. Or something that I wanted to clarify that I think was probably not clear in the paper. So we don't think of vacancies as unmet labor. Absolutely not. And so in particular, that's not what we say, U has to be equal to V. So the old idea in Beveridge's book from 1944, he said, I think full employment is U is equal to V. What he had in mind is that V is unmet labor. And so, if you have people looking for a job, if we have the same number of unmet labor, that should be full employment. But that's not what we do here at all. Vacancies here are just a way for us to measure the amount of labor devoted to recruiting in the economy. Now, ideally, what we would want is a BLS to go out and ask firms how much man hours they devote to recruiting every month. If we had that information, we wouldn't need vacancies at all. We would have the number of recruiters, we would have the number of unemployed, we would use that for the analysis. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that information. The only proxy we have for recruiters are vacancies. And it turns out that roughly 1 vacancy is equal to 1 recruiter. But again, we don't think of vacancies as unmanned labor at all. Vacancies are just a vehicle for firms to go and recruit people to come into their firms. Let's see, what else do I have? Oh, yes. Christie's point was interesting. I mean, I could flip it around. I could say it doesn't make sense to think about stable prices without thinking about full employment. Like your remark had really reflect, I think, the bias that the Fed has had to focus too much on stable prices and put the full employment mandate as kind of a secondary mandate. In the law, they should be both equally important. And we have measures to figure out what gives you stable prices. That's the NERU, although it's hard to measure. Here we're just saying, well, to satisfy the other mandate, we need another measure. That's the FERU. If these two coincide, well, then that's easy. That's a divine coincidence. The Fed can actually satisfy both mandates. But it's possible, in models, there is no guarantee that these two things are going to coincide. It's possible that the NERU and the FERU are not the same. And what I showed you is that they might not be the same. Now, in that case, the Fed faces a trade-off. How much weight do you want to put on deviating from full employment? How much weight do you want to put on deviating from stable prices or, your inflation target? And then, that's the job of the Fed to solve that trade-off and decide where they want to be in between. But in models, in modern models, there is no guarantee that these two things have to be the same. They can be, but there's no guarantee that they are. And so even though we don't have inflation here, it doesn't mean that, the analysis is meaningless in some ways. And the last thing, maybe I'll finish with Oleg's point. So that's the beauty of sufficient statistics. So sufficient statistics are usually used in public finance to try to think about optimal policies without putting too much structure on the economy. So here we're bringing that to macro. And our analysis is going to work in actually many models, irrespective of the shocks and various other things, as long as they have a beverage curve. Of course, that's not all models. And as you say, of course, as long as so here to apply to the Fed, it's as long as the central bank doesn't create other distortions. So here we're thinking about really a basic model in which it's nominal rigidities in prices or wages that create business cycle. Now in a world like this, if you have a beverage curve, nominal rigidities creating a cycle, this is going to apply whatever the detail of the model. If you have more complicated setup with financial crisis and stuff, it's going to be more complicated and you'll have to deviate from that.
Emmanuel, do you want to add something?
Yes, let me add a few words. First, I want to thank Pascal, for the presentation, the discussions, and everybody who commented. This is very, very useful and will allow us, to recalibrate the presentation. On substance, I want to talk very briefly about the points that were raised on prices, inflation. Maybe I'm naive, I'm not really a macroeconomist, but since 1990 to 2020, prices were stable. Yet, we would see, lots of fluctuations in unemployment. So in some ways, we could say that the price stability was solved, but yet there was the problem of what is the correct So in those so-called, normal times, you would need really a definition of what is the efficient unemployment rate, and it's really in extreme cases, that perhaps, we had an economy that was way too tight, that it triggered inflation, and that's when, price stability is going to come in. But, we expect that a well-functioning macroeconomy has solved, the price stability problem, but yet recession still happened, and you need something to guide you towards what is an efficient level of unemployment. Thank you.
Great.